What's up, guys? Back with another 40mm manila rope test. I will list all of the initial best numbers for you right now. For those of you just now tuning in, I've just been trying to change the format of my testing to include more tests in one video and more direct comparisons. But when I first filmed some of these, you can tell I'm actually talking to you right now in the top right one. I was still doing the old long form format, but I've just realized that I'm doing multiple tests on these different steels and I've got to get efficient about it, and I want to be efficient about the way that I display results to you guys as well. The question that I had hoped to address in this test is I noticed that the numbers for the Victorinox steels seemed quite high in comparison with some of the higher carbon stainless steels that I was testing last time. Which is to say, like, our highest Victorinox number hit 13, and I tried absolutely every stone and combination I could think of on the Victorinox knives in the early testing. So I wasn't sure if we were not quite reaching the full potential of those steels I was testing initially, that being CPM 154, S35VN, and Vanex, because Vanex only reached 10 cuts on the fine edge test and 20 cuts on the dual grit edge test. And the thing is if that was true measurement of edge retention with no other factors sort of factored in, then you could get better edge retention from a Victorinox paring knife than you can get from Vanex. So I had suspected in those videos, and I mentioned that I suspect that finer structure steels without a lot of carbide content at all, may have a bit of an advantage in best testing because they have this ability to retain this really fine edge, and best testing perhaps is not as sensitive to rounding over as much as like a paper slice test would. If you round over an edge, it's not going to cut paper very well anymore. But I had wanted to know in this test, if you've rounded over an edge and the edge is still fairly small, is it possible that those best numbers continue to remain good? I'll put the results on the screen now, but as you can see, there were two interesting effects. Number one is that although the dual grit edges seemed to sort of stabilize the edge retention, and I want to really emphasize that the dual grit edges were much easier to cut through the rope. So if you've got an aggression-based task, I think that it definitely does make sense to put a toothy or dual grit edge on your knife, regardless of what the best numbers show, because in my felt experience of trying to push it through the rope, the fine edges were so much harder at the end to just get through the rope. However, you can see that basically the dual grit edge on LC200N passed 400 grams best sooner. I tested it one more time because it was still feeling so good, but it did indeed not last as long as the beautiful fine edge that LC200N took on the Shapton Glass 8K. The other thing you can see is that with H1, it only cut one more time on the dual grit test, although towards the end you can see that some of the numbers were a little bit better. Another interesting phenomenon is that the distance between them is very small. Like LC200N on the fine edge tests sort of where I would expect it to, nearby sort of your S35VN and your CPM 154 in terms of the results so far, but just under it at 8 cuts is dual grit H1, and just under that is H1 on a fine edge. So I do think there is some effect to be expected, and I need to calculate it into my findings. It should be noted that I'm not sure you can cross-compare every single test here because we've got teeny little variables in edge length, which I'm trying to minimize, and slightly bigger variables in behind the edge thickness and edge curvature that do affect the test. And beyond that, we also have this difference that The simpler steels seem to hold on to their low best numbers for a little bit longer. Here's the results charted out over a chart that I made. I'm sorry I couldn't get a tick mark to show up at 300 grams. I'm not that well versed at Google Sheets, but hopefully this sort of simplifies the values for you. A lot of those values are under 300 grams anyway, as you can see, and there's overall quite a predictable flow to these low carbon containing steels in my test, which is that they drop through the sort of nice working edge category from like 200 to 300 a little bit more quickly than the high carbon steels. There's a bit less of this sort of up and down effect, but they don't want to pass that 400 gram mark. They just hold on to that edge that's nice enough for a long time. And I would say actually that that really lines up with my usage of these steels. I think something that we have to admit given this data is that while you'll have much better edge aggression in these steels, it's possible that when you have a steel that performs so well with a cloudy finish or a fine edge, that a dual grit edge is not necessarily going to double your edge retention, simply because these steels perform so stably on a fine or a cloudy finish that those finishes actually compete with a dual grit edge. I have to take this test into my EDC tournament and test it out a little bit more thoroughly, and I would be really interested to hear about you guys' sharpening experiences to see if this reflects sort of your use, but this is the findings that I have today. If you want to see the last video in the series, I'll put the link on screen now, and for the rest of you guys, I'll say peace out from the home slice. You guys take care.